Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're just going to give a few more minutes, just 1 or 2 more minutes for folks to trickle in. We'll be back shortly. Good morning, everyone. You're welcome to CNHED's December event, 2020 State of Home Ownership in Black America, Progress and Policy in a Pandemic, with Professor Vanessa Gail Perry of the George Washington University School of Business. My name is Precious Rideout from CNHED, and we will begin our presentation today.
Good morning, everyone. This is Steve Glaudet. I'm the president and CEO of CNHED. And the first thing I want to say is that we miss you. We miss seeing your faces at our monthly meetings. We miss the sidebar conversations that we always have with you. We miss the networking that we observe you having among yourselves. And it is one of the things that the staff and the board and I talk about our kind of new normal, about what we miss. We obviously missed our in-person community development week, but had a great virtual community development week in October. We, of course, missed our annual gala that we are punting until next year, when we will be allowed to be in each other's presence. But I just really wanted to start by saying that we really miss you. But we're here, and you're still making all the difference that you've always made. You've made even more of a difference during this time. We have been cataloging your unstinting service, your creative adjustments, your constant focus on vulnerable populations during the most vulnerable time in our lifetime. And I just want to say that we not only miss you, but we appreciate you. And so I want to get started, but I had to start with, we miss seeing your faces. We miss hanging out with you in person. And it will, as they say in the islands, there's a saying in Jamaica, when people are being impatient, and they always push you back with these two words, soon come. So soon come, we will be together again, and we look forward to it. I'm delighted this morning to be here with our guest speaker. CNHED began a relationship with her about a year and a half or 2 years ago to develop a small business capacity building curriculum. And I'm really pleased to say that we have launched our Elevate program that is a very thoughtful, developed over time curriculum to build the capacity of small businesses. And just a little cheap salesman talk about our curriculum, because there are a lot of efforts out there to help small businesses. Our curriculum, I think I like to refer to it as pure. And it's pure in that it really just focuses on building the capacity of small businesses. There are other efforts out there to build their ability to lend or to borrow. There are other efforts out there to build their ability to contract with government or build their ability for a specific outcome. What I like about our curriculum is it really focuses on the growth challenges of small businesses and the capacity needs, not from a borrowing perspective, not from a contracting perspective, but from a success perspective. And so I'm delighted that we have partnered with our speaker this morning around the curriculum. And the first cohort has been launched. Applications are still being accepted to December 21st. If you go to the CNHED website, you will be able to see. But I want to thank our speaker for working with us so diligently over the last 18 months or so to put together something with her and her team that I think we're all going to be very proud of and that I think is going to be useful. Our speaker this morning's range of expertise goes way beyond small business. I have to admit, until the announcement of this, Professor Perry, I didn't know all the range of expertise that you touch. But what we're here today is to talk about the state of 2020 housing and the impact on African Americans during the pandemic. And I think these issues transcend the pandemic in some ways, but they certainly were illuminated because of it. And I think it's fascinating that they did a body of work around it. So without any further ado from me, let me introduce our guest speaker. She is a professor of marketing, strategic management, and public policy in the School of Business. Her research on consumers in financial and housing markets, public policy, and consumer welfare has been published widely in scholarly journals and practitioner-oriented outlets. In addition, she's been an invited speaker at many industry conferences and events, such as the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland's Policy Summit on Housing, Human Capital, and Inequality, the Federal Trade Commission's Conference on Consumer Information and the Mortgage Market, among others. Professor Perry served as senior advisory to the U.S. Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development from 2011 to 2012. And I could go on and on and on. What I will say as I introduce our speaker is that Professor Perry is an amazing resource to the District of Columbia. And CNHED, we happenstanced to Professor Perry in our quest for someone to help us do this curriculum. What I've learned since we've known her is that she is a resource beyond the obvious, and we are imagining that we will partner with Professor Perry in many other ways beyond the curriculum. We're going to batten down the hatches and get our cohorts moving and being successful. But I am so looking forward to hearing from her today and learning about her study. I will say that if you have questions, put them in the chat. Dr. Perry and I will field them after her presentation. But it's with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor and Dean Vanessa Perry.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you so much, Steve. That was quite an introduction. I keep looking around like, who is he talking about? But I really, really am honored to be now part of the CNHED family. It has been a wonderful almost 2 years time frame when we have had a chance to partner on this initiative, and I'm hoping to do many more. I also want to thank the National Association of Real Estate Brokers for sponsoring this report, for commissioning this report, for their support. They are the ones who have been for years doing the State of Housing in Black America project. This is my first time. I'd also want to acknowledge the really accomplished experts who also contributed to this report. And I would love it if you are more interested to visit the SHIBA2020.com, SHIBA 2020.com website if you want a sort of more accessible than a 90-page PDF version of the full report. So what I'd like to do is spend just a few minutes giving you an overview, and then we're just going to open it up for questions and discussion. This report is about where Black home ownership, where we find ourselves in terms of Black home ownership in this pandemic, in light of this pandemic. So I'll move to the next slide, please. I'm going to start out with just an overview of where we are. I'm going to talk about sort of the size of the market and some unmet opportunities. I'm going to talk then about some challenges in both the mortgage and housing markets that explain why we are where we are with the Black homeownership rate in the US. And then I'll wind up with some public policy solutions. Next, please. So as of the start of the second quarter of 2020, the Black homeownership rate was 47% for Black households. That's compared to 76% for white households. And what this chart shows, it's got the homeownership rate for Black households in red and the homeownership rate for white households in green. And what's interesting is that the distance between these two bars, these two lines, doesn't change very much at all over time. There's a slight narrowing around 2000 in the period leading up to 2008, which you might recall was the subprime mortgage market crisis, but that was only a teeny tiny slight narrowing in this gap. The homeownership rate is approximately the same as it was for Blacks at the time of the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. So what does that mean? That means that despite all of the various public policy efforts to promote homeownership and all of the gains that we have made in education, et cetera, we're still facing some of the same barriers that we were over 50 years ago. Next, please. So despite that rather bleak outlook, there are significant opportunities for Black homeownership. So in 2019 alone, there were 966,000 mortgage applications from Black prospective home buyers. And according to a Freddie Mac study, approximately 3 million mortgage-ready Black households. They call these mortgage-ready because they're households that have the income, could qualify from a credit perspective, and are about the age that people start buying homes traditionally. And so according to these studies, these are 3 million people. That's a lot of market opportunity. This chart here just sort of breaks down these mortgage applications that were received in 2018 and 2019 by region. And look at the difference in the height of the bars, the first four, which were 2018, and the growth that occurred between 2018 and 2019. In particular, look at the volume of applications in the southern region of the United States. It really is impressive. Next, please. It's important to us for us to remember sort of why we care so much about home ownership. We care about home ownership because home ownership is the #1 route to wealth building and wealth accumulation, not just for Black families, but for everyone in the US. And what we're showing here is sort of the relative disparities in wealth accumulation for Black households versus typical white households. And so what we're seeing here is that even for Black homeowners see lesser returns, and there's a lower return to home ownership for Black households and Black consumers than there are for white. These disparities in home ownership and access to credit, which drive the disparities to home ownership, they contribute to cumulative wealth inequality. And I'll come back to this point a couple more times in this discussion. Next, please. So why do we see these high denial rates of mortgage applications for Black applicants and eventually lower home ownership rates? Well, part of it is the problems in the mortgage market. Black borrowers face challenges when they apply for mortgage in being able to qualify for mortgage credit due to systemic racism and cumulative disadvantage. And I can't emphasize this point enough, because a lot of the narrative that has been put forth about Black people being able to, and Hispanic people to a large extent, being able to qualify has to do with a lack of financial literacy or a lack of savings or poor decision-making. But the truth of the matter is, all of these factors can be tied very directly to historical racism and the resulting cumulative disadvantage. And so these cumulative disadvantages manifest themselves in all of the 3 C's, the so-called 3 C's of mortgage lending: credit, collateral, and capacity. And so I'm going to walk through each of these in the next couple of slides. So here, what I'm just showing is some of the stark differences in the circumstances for the average Black home buyers versus the average white home buyers. Average Black home buyers are buying homes that are cheaper. There's some reasons for that I'll come back to, but in general, the new home value for Black borrowers is about $215,000 compared to about $255,000 for the average white new home value. Black borrowers are much more likely to obtain FHA or VA insured mortgages, whereas white home buyers are more likely to obtain conventional loans. Black home buyers have higher debt to income ratios, lower FICO credit scores. They tend to have higher loan to value ratios, which really is just a way of looking at down payments, which means lower down payments in general, and significantly higher, more denial rates. And the denial rates tend to be because of debt to income ratios and FICO scores that are out of range for mortgage lenders. Okay, next, please. Next, please. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but if you want a deeper dive, I would direct you to Maurice Jourdain Earl, one of the contributors who's got a special section in the full report where he talks about the increasing share of mortgages that are insured by FHA and VA that go to Black and Hispanic borrowers compared to the conventional market. The big takeaway being is that the conventional market, who predominantly sells loans to Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, since the mortgage crisis, has basically underserved Black and Hispanic borrowers by not purchasing these mortgages, and the slack has been taken up largely by FHA and VA. Now, it is the case that they're all of these entities are funded by the government and funded by US taxpayers. So think about the fact that, you know, even though Black taxpayers are paying the same taxes as anyone else, they are not necessarily deriving the full benefits of the mortgage credit system because of these disparities. Next, please. So this is probably the most unsettling set of findings, I think, from this research, that the home values of Black-owned homes are significantly lower than they are for homes owned by white owners, and this has persisted over time. This occurs because, in general, Black people are more likely to live in predominantly minority neighborhoods. Actually, they don't have to be predominantly minority. They just have to have sort of a relatively higher share of minority-owned homes for collateral values to be lower than they are in similarly situated white homes. This becomes a problem that creates its own set of problems for wealth accumulation and for the further ability to afford home ownership. Next, please. Black people pay more for home ownership in a variety of ways. And if you want more details on this, I will direct you to another sort of call out sub-report that's within this report by my colleagues from my former HUD colleagues, Michelle Aronowitz and Ed Golding and Jung Choi from Urban Institute, who've done a really careful analysis of these additional costs that are borne by Black people for home ownership over time. And what they found is, on an annual basis, on average, Black home buyers pay $743 more in interest payments, $550 more in insurance premiums, $390 more in property taxes. And so over the life of the loan, this is over $13,000 more than similarly situated white homeowners. And this turns out to be about $67,000 in lost retirement savings. So while people might shrug off the difference in the likelihood of Black homeowners borrowing FHA or VA mortgages versus conventional, this is one reason why we see these interest and insurance premium disparities. And we can also see how much of a difference this really makes. This is real money. This chart just kind of shows the differences in mortgage interest rates for FHA versus VA. And if you don't read anything in the chart at all, if you just look at the red bars are Black borrowers, the blue bars are white borrowers, and just look at, for the FHA loans, how much higher the red bar is for Black borrowers than it is for any other category, FHA or conventional. It really is stark. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned a bunch of problems in the last few minutes, and I apologize for those, but they are real issues. And I'm hoping that going forward, looking at some of these public policy and industry solutions, maybe we can solve them. One thing I think is really critical is for us to increase the COVID-19 pandemic relief. There's been a number of federal loan forbearance programs that have been very helpful, but let's face it, a lot of Black homeowners and Black renters have not been the beneficiaries of some of these forbearance programs. So some of these, along with some of the credit reporting restrictions, are really important for us to be able to make sure that we can continue to make progress in the mortgage market. And in home ownership. We need to restore some of the fair housing regulatory protections and enforcement efforts that were approached very vigorously in the Obama administration, but not so much in the Trump administration, like the affirmatively furthering fair housing and the HUD's disparate impact standard. I can talk more about that if anyone is interested in, but these were put in place to really try to address some of the systemic issues posed by past flawed policies and redlining and racism that we all acknowledge occurred in the marketplace and still occur. And so we need to try to do what we can to bolster those and get them back and expand these policies. We need to look at mortgage pricing, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail about that, but the so-called loan level pricing adjustments that increase cost for people with lower down payments or maybe weaker credit scores and higher debt levels. We need to look at the disparate impact of those policies on minority homebuyers. And then down payment assistance is one of these kinds of practices that has an immediate and direct impact on people's ability to qualify for mortgages. And so we need to pressure our local governments, state, as well as the federal government to support additional down payment assistance kinds of programs. Student loan forgiveness is another big one that will have a direct impact on people's ability to save money for down payments and for home ownership. And then organizations like CNHED, having discussions like this are important in shaping the policy debate and demanding what we need from the industry to try to address these issues. So next slide. That's it. I hope that if you are interested, you can take a look at the full report or visit sheba2020.com, or feel free to reach out to me directly at my GW address. I love to talk about these issues and I'm definitely looking forward to discussing some possible solutions. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. I think that was a great, well-constructed snapshot of the current state of affairs, some with long historical legs into past practices, capturing some exacerbation from the moment that we're in. And what I love about it most was that you offered solution insights. One of my jokes is that 99.9% of the population can tell you what the problems are, but there are only a few people who are actually focused on solutions. So I like that. We have one question from Donnie Crawford asking you to say a little bit more about the key differences between the FHA and conventional loans. So I think he's asking if you have a little deeper insight to those differences. Obviously that resonated with him as a stark contrast.
Sure, happy to do that. And I apologize for skimming over it because it's a really important issue that many of us miss. So the FHA and VA are insurance programs. VA is set aside for veterans, but it has essentially the same criteria in place as Federal Housing Administration loan insurance programs. Both of those are federally funded mortgage insurance programs. And so lenders have a choice between sort of routing borrowers who are interested in a mortgage to FHA or VA versus what we call conventional loans. Conventional loans are also provided typically by the private market. They often carry insurance by private mortgage insurance companies. And the conventional loans in general have some more restrictive eligibility requirements than FHA and VA. That said, and what happens with all of these mortgages is that they're sold to the secondary market, who is comprised of Wall Street investors. And so they're here to make money, and they make money off of the interest that the borrowers are paying on their mortgages. And so rates tend to be higher in a lot of cases for FHA and VA mortgages because they are considered to be slightly higher risk of default. And the conventional market, because the eligibility requirements are more strict, they tend to have a lower risk of default. The truth of the matter is, because these mortgages are pooled together and sold in pools as mortgage-backed securities, the overall risk of default is very, very low. A 2% is probably the highest default rate that the industry has ever seen across the board. And so there's much ado about nothing as the industry acts as if defaults are going to, have a ripple effect and shut down the entire economy, when the truth is there are checks and balances built in to make sure that that doesn't really happen. So in other words, when we show that the rates that are FHA and VA mortgage rates, and that Black borrowers are more likely to have to pay these rates, we know from empirical research and evidence that is very widespread and agreed upon, that many Black borrowers are overpaying. There's really no reason why these disparities in rates need to exist. And I won't go any further than that because I could go on all day and I don't want to do that. But those are essentially the differences.
I was glad that you mentioned on your list. I was actually waiting once I realized you had a list that you have student loans listed as one of the impediments and the need for student loan, not only forgiveness, but probably student loan reform. A couple of years ago, I was asked to speak on a panel about the decline in home ownership among 30 to 40-year-olds. It was the lowest since World War I or II or something like that. And so I called my daughter, who at that time was 35 and married with a PhD. She borrowed her way to her advanced education. And I asked her, was she thinking about buying a home? And my daughter, who is far smarter than me, ran this math at me. And she said, Dad, I've done the math. I will be 65 when I pay off my last student loan. My student loan bill is about somewhere between a half and 2/3 of a mortgage note. I have to choose between paying off my education and buying a home until I can get my income up. Can you, is there more you can say about the pervasive impact of student loans on home ownership?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Actually, your daughter's story is a very common one, because, you know, what we were taught in our generation and before is that, you know, you go to college, you get a great job, and things like home ownership will sort of automatically follow as a matter of time. It's just sort of part of what happens. But here's how past racism and discrimination manifest themselves, um, and tie into the student loan problem. If you happen to be lucky enough to have been grown up in a family where they owned a home, let's just say your parents bought a house in, say, the 60s and 70s somewhere, and let's say Northwest Washington, D.C. And now their home is worth $750,000, $800,000. When it was time for your family to send you off to college, they could go down and they could take out a cash out refi and peel off $100,000 or $200,000, and they could send you to the most expensive school in the United States, and you could graduate with no student loans. And so upon graduation, you get your job, you start setting aside a little bit when you can, in between your little vacations with your friends in the DR or whatever. And after you've been able to sort of buy your new car, but you could start on that trajectory, and becoming a homeowner would not be that far of a reach. But if you come out and you have to pay, I think the average student loan payment is something like $300 a month, then you're not able to start that savings process. Not only that, your parents decide they're going to move off to a retirement home and leave you their house, which you can either sell or rent out or move into. There's yet another financial boost, evidence of intergenerational transfer that occurs as a result of sort of your family circumstances. Well, a lot of Black families couldn't buy homes in the 60s and 70s, and certainly not before, because of lack of access to credit, because of redlining, because of discrimination, because of restrictive covenants, because of, you know, segregated areas, because of all sorts um, of bad public policy at the federal, state, and local level. And for those reasons, not only did many Black families not have the opportunity to become homeowners, but when they did become homeowners, they ended up being homeowners in neighborhoods that have lower values than similarly situated white households and white neighborhoods. And so for multiple reasons, here we find ourselves in a student loan problem that is not of our own making.
Thank you, Professor. Pamela Nelson, who's a DC realtor, asks, as a DC realtor, what actions do you suggest I take to help bridge this troubling gap of Black ownership, home ownership? So here's a realtor who's, you know, in another part of the food chain, if you will, asking what she can do to assist potential Black homeowners.
I would say, so thank you for your question. I would say that since you're on the ground, you're the one that is working with people and helping walk them through the process. And one of the things that I think is so critical, particularly, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I'm maybe speaking to people who don't realize how critical advice from realtors on the entire process is to helping people navigate the kind of decisions that they make. So, you know, a lot of people will ask their realtor, you know, what is my best, what can I afford? And what is my best option in terms of a mortgage loan? Should I look at an FHA or VA loan, which there are some issues in expensive areas like this one, because so many of the mortgages actually are above the loan limit for FHA, VA, and traditional conventional loans. And so at any rate, these are the kinds of decisions that you are in a position to really be able to help people navigate, and so that they can sort of understand both the value and the risks of home ownership. And you're able to do it far better than I am, back sitting behind my computer crunching numbers, or others. And so I think anything that you can do to sort of, well, on a formal or informal basis, to continue to provide outreach to communities is definitely going to continue to be helpful.
Thank you, Professor. Joseph Sharp asked, and I'm sure this was demonstrated in one of your charts because I think I saw it, but I know we were moving kind of through them fairly fast. He asked, are veterans paying higher rates if they have a VA loan? Are they paying higher interest rates if they have a VA loan?
It depends. It depends. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depends on that particular veteran's, where they fall in terms of their credit score, their down payment, and their debt levels, their debt to income ratios. All of those matter. All of those matter. So you could actually be paying a lower rate as a veteran. But a lot of times people go to the VA because it's easier to qualify on the front end. And it may actually be cheaper initially, but more expensive over the life of the loan. And so it's not a straightforward answer to your question, but it's an excellent question.
So Yvette from our team asked, and I'll answer a little bit from what I know, but I just can't remember the specifics. So her question was, has data on just DC been done? And I don't know if your research was segmented in ways that can do that. I know, of course, all of us who are in the affordable housing field are the recipients of data from other bodies of work being done that have a specific focus on the district. But was data crunched in a segmented fashion that you all have access to data on just DC?
So, hi, Yvette, my buddy. So love my CNHED family. So the focus of the report was national, but we did have to do some breakdowns. And so we did do some DC specific analyses. We looked at affordability, for example. We looked at housing opportunities in the area, for example, and then we looked at segregation. And the reason we weren't focused on DC specifically, but the reason why we looked at those factors is because we were comparing them to other metropolitan areas with high proportions of Black residents. And DC is sort of an interesting puzzle. I think because the homeownership rate in DC is surprisingly high, given how expensive it is as a market. It's in the top 10 most expensive markets in the US for housing. But I think that's because the homeownership rate in DC has been higher historically, because levels of education and income in DC have been relatively higher than other cities for several generations. And so that's why when you look at DC compared to other areas of the country, we're in a better place in terms of home ownership. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it certainly is higher than other areas. And there are also opportunities because we have a large metropolitan area where closer into the city, it's extremely expensive, but it gets more affordable as you move into further, more outlying areas. And so the answer to your question is, All of the data are available for DC specifically, but we didn't do a lot of in-depth DC specific analyses. I happen to live in the area, so I'm always thinking using DC as a kind of frame of reference.
This is going to be a blended question of two questions, and this is one of those moments that's going to painfully remind me of the challenges of remote engagement. And so I'm going to encourage audience members who may have a response to this to type a response in the chat. And I'm not sure, Professor, if your level of exposure to data in your study took you into the program realm, but the blended question are one from Denise Nicholson, who asked to comment on the housing choice voucher as far as it's supporting home ownership, and the other one is does DHCD's HPAP program benefit African Americans? And so if we were in our typical conference room setting, we would ping pong this between audience members, because some of the people on this call are experts at use of not only use of, but policies around the housing choice voucher program. And of course, some of our members are actually utilizers of the HPAP program as well. So I don't know, Professor, if you have responses to those specifics, but what I'm going to ask audience members to do who know responses is to type responses in to the chat, so that both Denise and this is Yvette again asking about HPAP around those two questions. So I'm going to reframe them real quickly. One is, how does the housing choice voucher program support home ownership? And then the other one is, does HPAP programs benefit African Americans? And so audience members, if you have responses, please put them in the chat. Professor Perry, if you have any commentary on that, please offer. Oh, Professor Perry, you're muted.
Yes.
There you go.
Sorry. Yeah, I know nothing about the Housing Choice Voucher Program or its key features. I know a little bit about the HPAP program, and I have to say it's a model similar to there's others that helps people. I believe there's a home ownership counseling component. There's a down payment assistance component. That's got to be helpful. Anything that can help offset the costs of the upfront costs of, down payment and closing is going to help, because in a lot of cases, that's all that is between a prospective home buyer and home ownership. And so programs like that are always going to be in favor of those. I don't know how the Housing Choice Voucher program works. I just don't know anything about it.
So one person just wrote, the Housing Choice Voucher Subsidy Assistance is available to eligible program participants for up to 15 years. So it provides subsidy over a 15-year period. What I will say about HPAP, and this is kind of, HPAP is one of those things where it at least is in part up to the HPAP program managers to help minorities qualify for the program. So I think this is an issue where intentionality makes a difference, because HPAP is designed to help people of certain income levels, and they can be black, white, brown, yellow, whatever. And so I think that this is where the service provider, not the program, even though I'm sure there are policies at the governmental level that both incentivize and discourage participation that could have some racial lens that constantly needs to be examined. I will say that the CNHED members that I know who operate HPAP programs are intentional about targeting persons of color, and they do it with the intentionality because of that equity building platform that homeownership represents. So I think that to the extent that HPAP is being directed in an intentional way, that CNHED members have a lot to do with that. Let me see, I got questions popping in. Some of them may be comments around that. Let me just, so question from Susan Punette. I hope I got that right. We work with young people who are in and aging out of foster care. We had just started thinking about whether we spark their interest in better managing their money by focusing on the idea of breaking stereotypes and saving to become homeowners. Do you know of any good resources for young people, especially those in general who have no exposure to the idea of building wealth?
Sure. And what's funny is, actually it's not funny, is that some of the local banks have some of the best financial literacy programs designed specifically for young people that I've seen. And so, and what they will do if you invite them, obviously they're not doing a lot of these nothing in person these days, but they provide often free materials and workbooks, and they'll go to classrooms and do guest speakers, which I'm sure could be done virtually. But there are plenty of programs that are designed to introduce these concepts to young people and give them sort of hands-on experience with balancing a budget and financial planning, and understanding concepts like interest and how to use credit and how the system works. And I think all of those things are, extremely important. You mentioned something about stereotypes. There's this stereotype that suggests that people of color don't know how to manage money because they don't have any experience with money. And then people like to cite examples of, professional athletes and these other kinds of, MC Hammer and, these kinds of situations which are, extreme and unfortunate, where people end up making really poor financial decisions and lose a lot of money. But I actually push back on that a little bit, because if you follow that narrative too far, it starts to sound like we found ourselves in this situation simply because we made poor choices. And I actually reject that because of what I started out talking about, which was systemic racism and cumulative disadvantage. And so you could make the best decisions as you could possibly make, but not having access to the same resources as similarly situated other people because of your race is something that we need to absolutely acknowledge and push back on the system to require the system to correct that. Because all of the educational gains that we have made over the years have brought us to exactly the same homeownership rate that we had in 1968. So while it is really important for young people to start getting prepared to both have money and know what to do with it, I wouldn't want to push that narrative too far. Because there are real systemic issues that have to be corrected before we start seeing real significant change.
So I want to say a couple of things. One, some of the answers are in the chat. There is a response from Raquel Williams about resources for aging out of foster care. There is a statement about how to use the housing voucher choice program, not necessarily to get direct home ownership, but to result in savings that then can lead by using the program to assist with rent. It allows for savings that could be used for down payment and ultimately home ownership. I will say on some of the asset stuff that one of our members, the capital area asset builders, are a good resource, and they really focus on some of the really restrictive barriers to moving in that direction around savings accounts. They have some programming to help low-income families build savings without being penalized, without having other forms of assistance penalized. They work on a policy level, but they also have direct programs and services. And then other CNHED members focus on that as well. Let me just scroll real quick because we've had questions coming in. Can you comment more on the enduring racial segregation in DC and its impact on home ownerships in certain parts of the city, like Northwest? You mentioned the AFH at the federal level, but do you advocate for specific policies at the city level that would facilitate more integrated neighborhoods and increase African-American households' access to city housing inventory in all parts of the city? Before you answer, Dr. Perry, let me say that this has been a emerging theme in the District of Columbia. It's being it's attempting to be addressed at the zoning level, at the comprehensive plan development level, and even in some individualized comprehensive neighborhood development models that are happening within the district. I think that there is an awareness that we are a segregated city when it comes to issues related to wealth, home values, and more, and that attempts are being made to address that. And I would just say, I mean, I think the issue is CNHED has been dragged into it to both offer opinion, policy recommendations, and even legislative intervention. You know, we find that it gets really complicated. I mean, at some point, it boils down to the simple common denominator of NIMBYism, that wealthy people don't want subsidized housing, and there are hard arguments being made on both sides of the aisle. Is, you know, why would a $1.3 million homeowner want a $450,000 home value adjacent to them, and what impacts that have? You know, so it's like that Facebook saying, it's complicated.
Yeah.
it is complicated, but there is more awareness and I think emerging political will to face the issue, and efforts underway to address it. But please, Professor Perry, would love to hear your response as well.
I'm just, my head is swimming right now because I've also done some work on gentrification in Washington, D.C. in particular. I have studied that. And so I guess the big point I'd like to make is that we know that housing issues are local. They can only really be meaningfully addressed on the local level because there are nuances. DC's issues start with zoning. They start with sort of historical neighborhoods that were historically predominantly Black, and many sort of city level policy decisions that have occurred that have sort of rocked that boat, if you will, and changed the game. We've seen Black flight in both directions, Black flight out and white flight in. You know, we've seen all sorts of patterns that have shaped the local policy responses. And we're definitely going to have to take some active steps if our focus is making sure that there's equity in the distribution of resources. Because as the composition of the city changes, the beneficiaries of many of these programs, things that we were just talking about, the HPAC programs and others, the beneficiaries of those are going to change as well. And we could end up in a situation where, you know, there are sort of lots of local policies that are directed to help local residents, but benefits don't actually accrue to those who are in desperate need of better equity and better access. So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's my 2 cents on that.
So I want to highlight one thing real quick. We are at time, but we can keep going as long as people are staying on. And Professor Perry, if you have a couple of moments. But Alice Revel with with DC Housing Authority has said if people have questions about the Housing Choice Voucher Homeownership Assistance Program, to contact her. Her email is arevel@dchousing.org. So that's arevel@dchousing.org for people who may have questions on that. And as I'm looking through here, most of the questions, I'm going to end with this question. There are a few more questions coming in, but I highlighted this for you, Professor Perry, when we were chatting before we started. But you know, I would love for you to mention what was the most surprising thing that you ran into in your research. As you compiled these data and you saw these sharp contrasts, was there one thing that leapt out at you as most alarming, or most encouraging, or most surprising from the data that you looked at?
So I'll give you two answers at once. The most surprising finding, I think, was that the homeownership rate for Black college graduates is approximately the same as it is for white high school graduates. And in my mind, I had thought that with education, that would bring sort of higher incomes, and that maybe that would sort of explain more of the disparities in homeownership than it actually does. I found that very surprising. In terms of sort of from a positive perspective, and I have to say, when I first started this project last summer, I was depressed because of what I was finding. But what was encouraging was to look at the growth between 2018 and 2019 in the number of mortgage applications for Black prospective home buyers. That was really impressive, because what that says to me is that if we can fix some of these systemic issues with the mortgage market and maybe make some down payments available, alleviate some of the student loan burdens, with some of these relatively straightforward intermediate steps, we could make some real gains in a relatively short time. I found that to be very encouraging.
That's great. So we are at time, and I want to kind of close out by pointing you back. First of all, Professor Perry, thank you. Not just for this research, but for, you know, connecting with the work happening in DC in a broad sense. We love the fact that we were able to adopt you. We love even more that you adopted us. We look forward to launching Elevate and having cohort after cohort go through this curriculum that we all put so much work into. I think that you are a hidden gem within the District of Columbia. We're going to try to lift you up so that you that your resource can be better known and better used. Not so much that we drive you into early retirement, but I think that you are a wealth of resource for many of us doing this work. A couple of things as we close out on the screen, and let me ask you, Dr. Perry, will you give us permission to send this presentation, the PowerPoint that you've developed, out to the attendees? Because somebody asked. Okay, we'll do that.
Yeah, sure.
You can see the link to the report on the screen, and you can also, because she was gracious enough to give it, you see Professor Perry's email address. Some questions didn't get answered. Feel free. She just put the report link in the chat, and her email address here for some questions that didn't get answered. And I just want to remind you again that we're still accepting candidates into the Elevate cohort number 1. It's on CNHED's website where you can get the information on the curriculum and how to sign up. We're really excited about it. We worked for a while to really design something that we thought would be unique, practical, and useful. And I'm really confident that we have that. So we want to encourage you, if you're not appropriate, please share it with networks that are connected to small businesses so they may become aware of it. And I want to thank Professor Perry again for a great and insightful, and I say that with an S, not a C, although there are elements of it that could be inciting, information about this issue. And thank you all so much for coming out. And CNHED members, I want to also remind you to check your emails for our annual event coming up in mid-December. I'm sorry that I'm losing sight of the date. I think it's December 13th. We're going to do something really unique. Normally we have an annual event where we kind of celebrate the holidays and the year of work. Obviously we can't do it in person. Usually we give you some updates on our accomplishments. We're not going to do that. We think we all need to laugh. So we have hired some seasonal comedians who are going to entertain us with seasonal cheer. It's December through Tuesday, December 15th, and you'll get notices. Come out and laugh with us. We've interviewed a tough group of local DC comedians. I think we all need a little comic relief from the season we've endured. So come out and join us on December 15th. You'll get multiple notifications about it. And again, Professor Perry, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays.
All right, take care.